windows of the world. It's wonderful to see all of you here today, and we have a wonderful presentation planned. We would like to welcome Mrs. Taryn Deaton and Mr. Brent Walker, who are here with us from the Baptist Joint Committee in Washington, D.C., which focuses on the separation of religion, the freedom of religion, and the separation of religion and state. I am here to introduce Mrs. Deaton this morning. How many of you know that there are 5 freedoms afforded to you by the First Amendment of the Constitution? We have a freedom of speech. We have the freedom of assembly, the freedom to petition, the freedom of the press, and also the freedom of religion. Our first speaker this morning has dedicated her time since graduating the seminary to advancing this wonderful cause, this freedom of religion. Mrs. Taryn Deaton has committed her life to a life of education and also advocacy. She has worked previously with the Healing Communities Prison Ministry and Reentry right here in Philadelphia. She has worked with the John Leland Center for Theological Studies. She has promoted the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and also has worked in the Ivy League at Columbia University. Beginning her life in her native Texas and finishing her undergraduate work at Southwestern University, she boldly came to Palmer Theological Seminary in 2011. She was a Brock Scholar, which means that she was a wonderful student. And she also was committed there to finishing the Master of Theological Studies degree. After her graduation, she maintained her residence in Washington, D.C. along with her husband, and now she works with this wonderful ministry, the Baptist Joint Committee. I'm excited. I know her, was able to recruit her to the seminary, and she's just a wonderful woman of God, committed to these great causes. And she wants to be able to share this information with us today, that we might be better informed and that we might go out into the world and make a difference. So welcome with a round of applause, Mrs. Taryn Deaton.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's really such a pleasure to be here with you all today. It's hard for me to believe that almost a year has passed since my graduation from Palmer. It seems like literally yesterday I was sitting here with you all, and things have just gone by so quickly. And I had such a wonderful experience at Palmer, and it's good to see friends today. Obviously the professors were excellent, and I think that one of the really unique things about Palmer and about Eastern is how diverse the student body was, and I think that has prepared me well for my work. Like Alex said, I live in Northern Virginia, and during my year at Palmer, I commuted back and forth each week, and I'd usually drive up on Mondays and go home on Wednesdays or Thursdays, but on the rare occasion that I had the chance to stay the weekend, I always tried to make it a point to be here on Friday mornings for Windows on the World, and I was just always very impressed by the quality of the speakers that Eastern was able to recruit to be here, but more importantly with the level of involvement of the student body with the speakers and the topics being discussed, and that just really encouraged me. And so when I started at the Baptist Joint Committee this past summer, and as we were talking about how we might engage more young people in the discussion about religious liberty, you all were an audience that really immediately came to mind, and I reached out to Nancy and we got it all set up, and it was great. So I'm glad to be here today to help to introduce you to the ministry that the Baptist Joint Committee does on Capitol Hill. But before I introduce you to Brent Walker, who's our executive director, who is really gonna do the bulk of the presentation today and the substance of it, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my own journey and how it led me to the work that I do in development now, and also how it led me to come to Palmer. It's a bit of a winding road, as I think a lot of our lives are these days. I think unlike a lot of you probably, and despite the fact that I grew up in a Christian family, it wasn't until I was well into my 30s that I really started to understand what the priesthood of all believers really meant and how that might translate to my life professionally. I grew up in a church tradition that left me with the impression that there was this hierarchy of callings. So at the top were people like pastors and ministers and missionaries, and then kind of in the middle was this group of people in the helping professions, and then down at the bottom were what we would kind of think of as secular workers, doctors and lawyers and business people and that sort of thing. And because I didn't personally feel called to excuse me, full-time vocational ministry, I never really thought about my day-to-day work as a calling or as a way to worship and glorify God. And so, as Alex said, I went to college and I got into my profession working in higher education. And about 6 years ago, my husband and I moved to the DC area, and I really felt at the time that God was calling me to learn a new skill set. And I had the opportunity to take a job as a fundraiser, which I have to tell you is something that I never really thought I wanted to do. But I felt very clearly that God was telling me that this was a skill set that I needed to learn, not only for the immediate work that I would be doing, but also for something that would be coming down the line. And I honestly really needed a job. And I also was, I'm generally open to learning new things. So I took the fundraising position, and I really enjoyed learning about the relational aspects of raising money. But around this time, I also really started to struggle very deeply with how my work and my faith were connected. And I also started to kind of think about grad school pretty seriously at the time. And so I remember going to this grad school fair, and I walk in the door, and right there in the middle was this table for a seminary. And I was just kind of shocked. And I saw it, and I thought, almost kind of like, what are they doing here? But I went and talked to them, and I, I never really considered going to seminary, but this idea just kind of kept, resonating with me. But my idea of being there was to look for MBA or MPA programs that would help me to really, grow as a leader in the nonprofit world. And I just didn't know what a seminary could offer me, but I kept kind of wrestling with that idea, and finally made the decision to enroll initially in a small seminary in the DC area, and then I transferred to Palmer in the fall of 2011. Personally, I loved my theological education. I miss it, but it really gave me the opportunity to explore my own unique calling, and it gave me the time to focus and kind of wrestle with, where, like I said, where my work and my faith intersect, and really to kind of understand more deeply how my skills and experiences and professional background might be used for building up God's kingdom. And at the same time, it gave me a chance to really kind of focus on the issues that I'm most passionate about, and to learn about what types of work and workplaces bring me joy. And I have to say that doing this in the context of being with classmates who were pursuing seminary educations from such diverse backgrounds, but also with such unique career goals in mind, really helped me to, again, develop a much deeper understanding of the unique gifts and talents that God gives us and the corresponding types of work that we're all created for. When I started my studies, I really didn't know where that would lead me professionally. My personal experience has been, when I've said yes to God, that it always leads somewhere interesting. I don't always know where it's going to go, but it's always interesting, and I was very right. Last spring, almost a year ago, I had a chance meeting after church one Sunday with the General Counsel for the Baptist Joint Committee, and that directly led to me being hired as their Director of Development just a few short months later. The thing I love about development work is first that it's a ministry, but also that it gives me a chance to invite people to participate in the work that God is doing through the Baptist Joint Committee, through their financial resources. And that's a really special thing to have the chance to work with people to do. And obviously the mission of our organization is something that I am very passionate about, and I think is very important. Now, my general impression of all of you as Eastern students is that You all have a much more mature and clear sense of an understanding of calling than I certainly did at your age, and probably that I have now. But I share all of this with you because I hope in some way that this might encourage you just to be open to God's call and to the many different ways that God might use you and your unique gifts and experiences and abilities, and then to be open to the interesting and unlikely venues that those skills and experiences might be used in. So before I introduce you to Brent, there's just a couple things I wanted to mention to you. First, we'd love for you to join us after this for lunch. There's still plenty of room, and I think it'll give us a great opportunity to maybe dive a little bit more deeply into some of the issues that we work on. I'd also, if anyone is interested in talking more about development and fundraising as a profession in any context, I'd love to have a chance to chat with you either today or in the future. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the BJC has a wonderful internship program, semester-long internship program for current college students, for recent grads, and for graduate students. It includes a monthly stipend and housing on Capitol Hill, and the opportunity to work with Brent and myself and the rest of our staff in the fight for religious liberty. And again, if you'd like to talk more about that or learn a little bit more about that, I'd love to talk with you. And lastly, we opened a brand new Center for Religious Liberty on Capitol Hill in October, and we would love to host you or a group who might want to learn more about our work there at that center. So again, if you're ever in the area, we'd love to have you stop by and see us. So now to the main event. I want to introduce you to my boss, Brent Walker, who's the BJC's executive director. Brent has been with the BJC since 1989. He joined the staff at that point as our general counsel, and in 1999 he became our executive director. Before he came to the BJC, Brent was in private law practice in Tampa. And in 1986, he left law practice to go to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where he earned a Master of Divinity. Brent is an ordained minister. He's an accomplished author and professor and a widely sought speaker. There's about 1 million things I could tell you about him. Don't get him started talking about baseball because you will not ever shut him up about it. Not really. But that is one of his passions in life, along with religious liberty. So I'm thrilled to welcome or to introduce him and for you all to have the chance to hear him talk about his life's work of fighting for religious liberty for all. So Brent Walker, thank you.
Taryn, thank you so much, and thank you, Palmer and Eastern, and all of you that helped nurture and form and give clarity to Taryn Deaton's sense of calling and to her ending up with the Baptist Joint Committee. Those of you who don't know Taryn, just from her short presentation, can readily see what a wonderful person she is and how much she adds to the Baptist Joint Committee's ministry, not just in development, although the lion's share of her work is spent there, but she has influences throughout our organization and is a real plus to our ministry in so many different ways. So thank you, Taryn, for that introduction and for all that you do. With our time this morning, what I would like to do is to look at what I call first principles, some general ideas, some seminal thoughts that influence the Baptist Joint Committee's work day in and day out, theological ideas and historical precedents to our work that inform what we do on Capitol Hill. And then at the end of the hour, having laid that sort of general groundwork, talk about some current issues, current church-state problems that we face. And if we run out of time there, then certainly over lunch. And I would add that my wish that you can join us for lunch as well, and we can have a more complete conversation. What informs our understanding of the proper relationship between church and state is a conviction that religious liberty is nothing less than a gift from God. It's not the result of any act of toleration or any concession on the part of the government. You know, one of the reasons that Baptists have always championed religious freedom, as much for others as for ourselves, flows from our understanding of Scripture and what Scripture teaches. And we really don't find a lot of proof texts in the Bible, but there are pervasive principles and suggestive inferences throughout the Bible. Our conception of religious liberty, first and foremost, flows naturally from our understanding of the nature of God. Okay? God is sovereign, and as such, God created government. We learn from Romans chapter 13. But God did not convey plenary authority to human institutions, including government. God is seen throughout the Scriptures as a liberating deity who loves his children and cares about that relationship enough to create us free to say yes, free to say no to God. God wants a personal relationship with us. God does not want to control us like puppets. Hence, God is sovereign, God is free, God is personal, and God is loving, the nature of God. It also adheres in the condition of humanity. God created human beings in God's image. We learn from Genesis chapter 1. And whatever else the doctrine of the imago Dei, the image of God, means, it suggests at least that we were created by God freely and able to respond to God. We are responsible deciders in terms of our relationship with God. This is what we Baptists have for more than 400 years now called soul freedom, that God-infused liberty of conscience that we all enjoy simply because of how God chose to create us and to relate to us. And even though created in the image of God for that personal relationship, human beings are still sinful and cannot be trusted completely to exercise absolute authority, particularly in government and in other coercive institutions. One does not have to be a thoroughgoing Calvinist, and I certainly am not, to understand the fallen nature of human beings and human institutions. One only needs to pick up the newspaper or watch CNN, and goodness sakes, we can say that with force today, can't we? The nature of God, the condition of humanity, and finally, the imperative of faith supports religious liberty. For faith to be authentic, it has to be free. Faith cannot be forced and be genuine at the same time. Coerced faith is an oxymoron. It can't exist. Jesus, for example, did not go chasing after the rich young man in Mark chapter 10 when he declined to sell all that he had and to give it to the poor, but instead Jesus let him go away sorrowfully. He did not go chasing after him to compel a conversion. Yeah, Jesus knocks, but Jesus never, ever kicks the door down. And the teachings of Jesus confirm the same thinking and informs our understanding of freedom. You know, one of the best known stories, of course, is the encounter between Jesus and those two most unlikely of allies, the Herodians and the Pharisees, the religious purists, the Pharisees and the Herodians, who were in league with the Romans. And their mutual disdain for Jesus bridged their divisions and caused them to ask him a question that was just bound to get him into hot water. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, they asked. They had him. If Jesus says yes, then his credibility with the Jews will be ruined. If he says no, then the Romans will charge him with sedition. We win. Jesus loses no matter how you cut it. But Jesus avoided their snare, and he would not be trapped. He said, what? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, Jesus is not articulating a constitutional doctrine here, nor is he talking about the wall of separation between church and state 1700 years before Roger Williams and Thomas Jefferson talked about those concepts. No, he's talking about the fact that there are these two kingdoms, to which we owe different duties and have different responsibilities. But his lesson, his object lesson there with the Herodians and the Pharisees, I think does lay some theological foundation for a constitutional doctrine, for a way of church and state to relate together that comes about 2 millennia later. The Apostle Paul announces the centrality of freedom time and time again. Yes, when he talks about freedom, he's often referring to freedom from sin and freedom from legalism, but his ringing words in Galatians that for freedom Christ has set us free, at least is congenial with the more modern notion of freedom from governmental interference or regulation. And at least for us Trinitarian believers, Paul's announcement that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. That clearly makes God present in freedom a very liberating thought. And finally, the language, whosoever will. I didn't do a check of this, but I wonder how many dozens of times in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, the words whosoever will come, whosoever chooses to follow, etc. Find it throughout Scripture. Implies a voluntariness in religion and free will through and through in that relationship of following Jesus. So Baptists became champions of religious liberty and church-state separation in large measure because we have always been people of the book. Baptists also valued religious freedom and church-state separation because they historically suffered the hard lessons of history. Their understanding was not just academic, it was existential. Early Baptists experienced firsthand the pain of persecution, the heartache and bloodshed occasioned by religious zealots armed with coercive power to enforce their will. From jail cells in England to stockades in Massachusetts Bay to whipping posts in Virginia, the historical litany is or should be familiar to our ears. After establishing the First Baptist Church on English soil, Thomas Helwys authored an important treatise on religious liberty titled A Short Declaration on the Mystery of Iniquity in 1612 and sent a copy of it off to King James I. And in his inscription to the king, Helwys wrote, quote, "The king is a mortal man, not God, and therefore hath no power over the immortal souls of his subjects to make any laws or ordinances for them and to set spiritual lords over them," end quote. Well, for his trouble, Helwys got thrown into Newgate prison there in London, and in due time, where he languished, he and his wife died. Often called the apostle of religious liberty, Roger Williams came from England to Massachusetts in 1631, preaching this idea of soul freedom, the notion that faith cannot be dictated by any government authority, but must be nurtured freely and expressed directly to God. Williams advocated that, quote, hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, end quote. And the theocrats in Massachusetts Bay were so offended that they kicked Roger Williams out of the colony, and he trekked down through the wilderness in the middle of winter, surviving the winter only with the help of the Narragansett Indians until he got down to a place that would become Rhode Island, and established a town that he called Providence. We know about Providence even today. Providence, because he judged that God's providence had led him to that very spot. Yeah, Williams was indeed a Calvinist in many ways. And he began that lively experiment of religious liberty, not just for himself, not just for Baptists, but for all of God's children. An evangelist preaching in Virginia during the heady decade of the 1780s, John Leland, after whom the John Leland Seminary is named, boldly advocated for religious liberty and the separation of church and state, and he played a pivotal role in convincing our nation's founders of the need for specific guarantees protecting religious freedom in the Bill of Rights. And he stood toe-to-toe with the likes of Madison and Jefferson and Mason and other founders, and never backed down on the way to the Bill of Rights. And then he later returned to his native Massachusetts, where he continued to speak out in favor of religious liberty and against state-established religion. Well, this pantheon of early Baptist freedom fighters, and I could name a dozen more if we had time, testifies to the Baptist heritage of blazing trails for religious liberty. And such a cloud of witnesses inspires modern-day advocates in general and Baptists in particular, including the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, in our work to extend and defend religious liberty for everyone today. Well, against this backdrop of centuries of religious persecution and intolerance in England and in most of the colonies, our nation's founders assembled in New York in 1789 to adopt a Bill of Rights to the new Constitution. Our forebears understood that when religious zeal gets combined with coercive powers, particularly the powers of the state, consciences are violated and persecution often results. But old practices die hard. Yes, the Puritans came to New England to search for religious liberty, and they found it. But what they gained for themselves, they turned around and denied to everybody else, like Roger Williams and Quaker Mary Dyer and others. All but 4 of the colonies had officially established churches and engaged in varying degrees of persecution and intolerance. All but 2 had religious tests for public office. 5 denied basic civil rights to Catholics, and several made blasphemy a capital offense. So things didn't change right away, by any means. But the wise architects of our republic had a different vision in mind for the new national government. The Constitution, adopted in 1787 in Philadelphia, there you go, never mentions Christianity a single time and speaks of religion only one time. And then in Article 6, where it bans any religious test for public office, for qualifying for public office. And then with the adoption of the First Amendment's religion clauses in the Bill of Rights, those first 16 words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, our founders made it absolutely clear that one's status in the civil community would not depend on a willingness to sign on the dotted line of any particular religious confession or even to be religious. Irreligion does not disqualify you from full citizenship under the new federal government. Yeah, religious liberty is often called our first freedom, the first freedom, because, well, because of the widespread conviction that was given to us first by God. That's the first thing that God bestowed on us at creation, but also because it's the first one that's ensured in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Both religion clauses were inserted to protect religious freedom, but in different ways. The Establishment Clause keeps government from advancing or privileging religion, and the second clause, the Free Exercise Clause, keeps government from burdening or interfering with religious practice, unless government can assert some paramount interest, such as peace, safety, public health, and welfare. Both are intended to keep government neutral with respect to religion, neither advancing it nor inhibiting it, but disengaging from religion and allowing people of faith to practice our religion as we see fit, rather than as some government official might want them to. It's important for us to recognize, thinking back to those days in the late 18th century, that the children of God and the sons of the Enlightenment worked together to develop governmental institutions that would protect what the former believed to be a gift from God, and the latter believed was a natural right or some kind of right of conscience, right of autonomy. And I don't think that any of that could have happened without both of these groups coming together, the religious and the secular, both wanting government to remain neutral towards religion. William Estep, a church historian of a generation ago, wrote an incredible book about 20 years ago called The Revolution Within the Revolution. And he takes on this topic and says that the only reason that we have the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights was because the so-called twice-born, he calls the evangelicals back then, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, and others came in and formed a coalition with the Enlightenment thinkers, and together were able to push through those protections for religious freedom and the others as well, speech and press and petition and assembly. Yeah, no less a scholar than conservative jurist and Professor Michael McConnell understands the importance of this partnership. Seeing it fueled by the first Great Awakening in the early 1700s, the drive for religious freedom and church-state separation was integral to the evangelical movement. McConnell notes this, quote, "The evangelical position ultimately coalesced with the secular liberal position as against the dying tradition of civic republicanism. This explains why more fervent evangelicals, including Baptists, tended to become Jeffersonians, notwithstanding the deism of Jefferson and the piety of his opponents. Religion, the evangelicals believed, was vital to civic harmony, but voluntary religious societies, not the state, are the best and only legitimate institutions for the transmission of religious faith, and with it, virtue," end quote. Permit me a brief sidebar here. Some today in the religious community, even in the more progressive Baptist community, see our current drive to perpetuate religious freedom and church-state separation as being rooted only in the Enlightenment, not theology or biblical principles. And I hope that my remarks today will dispel that canard. Baptists got it long before the Enlightenment thinkers came upon it. Thomas Helwys predated Locke by nearly a century, and Roger Williams preceded the Enlightenment thinkers of the late 18th century by at least 150 years. And even in modern times and postmodern days, if you think we are postmodern now, Baptists and other people of faith who advocate for religious freedom and the separation of church and state find their moorings in the Bible as much as, if not more than, in secular notions of the contours of faith, however important they are. That's why the Baptist Joint Committee is perfectly willing to partner with the ACLU and People for the American Way and others that don't have the same religious beliefs as we, but we have the same desire in a common outcome of religious freedom for all, whether you think it's a God-given right or whether you think it's a natural right. And we find common ground sometimes with folks on the right as well that don't come out of a religious heritage. So our nation's founders, yes, supported by our Baptist forebears, and yes, armed with Enlightenment values, wanted to ensconce robust protection for religious liberty in the Bill of Rights. That is to say, they intended to write a strong establishment clause and a strong free exercise clause. You know, it's a dicey enterprise to try to judge the so-called original intent of our founders. There are several Supreme Court justices that make a living trying to do that, and other scholars. It's terribly difficult. First of all, there is no monolithic intent among those 56 or 60 or more founders, depending upon who you count. There were many intents, plural, okay? And even conceding the point, intents are very hard to pin down and to translate into common practice, especially 225 years ago. I mean, our founders were politicians, smart, well-educated, well-intentioned to be sure, but still politicians. And whatever their intentions were, it seems to me that the words they used in the First Amendment and the surrounding history that we can evaluate lead me to conclude that they wanted a strong protection for religious liberty on both sides of the First Amendment. You know, some today say the Establishment Clause was intended only to keep the federal government from setting up a single national church or showing preference among faith groups, but not from aiding all religion generally. Well, I think they are wrong. I mean, if all the founders wanted to do was simply to ban the setting up of a single national church, they didn't do a very good job of saying so in the First Amendment. I mean, an early draft of the First Amendment said this: the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, end quote. Well, that draft was rejected and passed over. And the founders had ample opportunity to state that the government should be allowed to promote all religion on an even-handed, non-preferential basis. But the First Congress repeatedly rejected versions of the First Amendment that would have explicitly permitted such non-preferential aid. For example, the Senate rejected this proposal, this language: Congress shall make no law respecting or establishing one religious sect or society in preference to another. They did away with that, and two more similar proposals were turned away by our founders. No, the founders approved the much more expansive language to keep the federal government from making laws even respecting the establishment of religion. Religion generally, not a religion, not a national religion, but religion. No religion at all. They did not merely want to keep the federal government from setting up an official national church or to ban denominational discrimination. It does that. We shouldn't discriminate among religious traditions, and we shouldn't have a national church. But I think the founders wanted to do more than that in their vision for the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause in particular. And at the same time, a robust free exercise clause, the second part, was intended to advance or at least was consistent with the notion that sometimes our religious practice must enjoy an exemption from generally applicable laws that apply to everybody else. You know, by the time the First Amendment was crafted, almost every state, certainly Pennsylvania, I think the exception was Connecticut, every state had a state constitutional provision protecting the free exercise of religion. And it's almost as if our founders sort of copied off the state constitutions when they put the free exercise clause in the federal First Amendment. And those provisions in state constitutions generally protected not just belief or the right to worship, but also actions based on those beliefs. The free exercise of religion, not just the rights of conscience. And these protections in state constitutions could be compromised by the state only in rare circumstances where, to use the words of some of the state constitutions, peace and safety or civil injury or outward disturbance of others, or in some cases, and I don't know why they use this word so commonly, licentiousness that would result from the exercise of religion, except for in those rare cases where my exercise of religion is going to adversely affect someone else or society generally. Those early constitutions said you're free to worship and to practice your religion as you please. But where it does influence the rights of third parties, then somebody, and today the courts, have to balance those rights and negotiate those differences. But that's nothing peculiar to the religion clauses. I mean, the same thing with speech. You know, the proverbial shouting fire in a crowded theater is banned under the speech. You don't have the right to do that as a matter of free speech. Free press, you don't have the right to publish malicious lies, even about public figures, without committing libel. The right to petition, the right to assemble, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions can apply to those other First Amendment rights. So it shouldn't surprise us that there has to be some balancing that goes on when the accommodation of your religious freedom and your free exercise of religion somehow influences or prejudices third parties. And later on we can talk about how that's an important concept when we talk about exemptions from the Affordable Care Act, the contraception debate, and also how we do exemptions for religious compunction as we extend gay rights and the rights of same-sex marriage. How do you balance those out? All of this to say that the historical record argues persuasively that we have inherited constitutional constructs that were intended to provide strong protections for religious liberty on both sides of the First Amendment. I think with some exceptions, and we haven't been perfect, we've done a pretty good job over the past 25, 26 years now, protecting religious liberty, forbidding government from trying to help religion under the Establishment Clause, keeping government from trying to hurt religion under the Free Exercise Clause, to the extent that I do believe we have become the envy of the world in terms of how we negotiate the incredible religious pluralism that we enjoy in this country, and how we accommodate the rights of conscience for everybody involved. I am concerned today, though. I think we're kind of getting away from that. The U.S. Supreme Court has tended over the past few years to water down both sides of the religion clauses. Back in 1948, a very important Establishment Clause case was decided about whether the state of New Jersey could pay for the transportation expenses for students who attended parochial schools. The court divided 5-4 on how that came out, but all 9 justices understood that the Establishment Clause would provide a strong protection, had a very separationist understanding of the Establishment Clause, all 9. Today you have 4 and maybe 5, depending upon how you count. For years after World War II, as a matter of free exercise, the court said, no, government can't interfere with your free exercise of religion unless it can show a really good reason, a compelling state interest to the contrary. But otherwise, they have to accommodate you. Well, at least since 1990, the Supreme Court in the Smith case, the Native American peyote case, didn't just rule that the Native Americans couldn't ingest peyote, but actually changed the law completely for everyone concerned to say that the government doesn't have to show that compelling interest, but can pretty much do whatever it wants in terms of restricting religious exercise without making that strong showing. And through the leadership of the Baptist Joint Committee and other groups, we've helped Congress pass some legislation that counters some of that. But still, as a matter of constitutional interpretation on the free exercise clause in the United States Supreme Court, there's not much left there for us to feel that we have some protection through. Anyway, we got 5 minutes, I think. Well, let me just stop at this point. I think we've done a pretty good job in this country, but I think we face a lot of challenges today, particularly in the Supreme Court and in culture generally, that I'll be glad to talk to you about now or at lunch if you wish. Any questions or? Yes, ma'am.
Sometimes when I hear things, I find that I misinterpret things, so I would like to get clarity.
Okay.
When you say talk about religious freedom, while I think all of us appreciate the fact that we could freely worship whom we want,
Right.
and all other religions as well. But for example, when my children wanted to read a Christmas story in public school, we will prohibit, and we ask, but it's okay, and then we encourage all other faith to do the same thing. But the school wanted to completely just eliminate it.
Right.
So on the one hand, I appreciate that, but then on the other, I don't. So what exactly, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
No, that's a great question.
Religious freedom, because I find that in today, chaotic state, I wish religion was a little bit more prominent.
Yes, to argue for separation of church and state is not to say that our culture should be secularized or that that religion shouldn't be voiced in the public square. Absolutely, it should. The only point that I was making today is that it's not the government's job to do that. It's your job and my job and the church's job and the seminary's job and culture's job. Going back to what McConnell said, it's important to have good values and to be friendly to religion, but it's not the job of the government to make that happen, particularly with the incredible religious pluralism that we have in this country. How can you possibly even pretend to promote all religion even-handedly? There's so many different religions. It's not government's job to make those decisions about which religion is right, which religion is wrong, or to even try to promote them all at the same time. But the example that you mentioned is really good, religion in the public schools, and I could have given a whole talk on that, because that's where a lot of our work has been done at the Baptist Joint Committee over the last 20, 30 years to figure out how to say no to government-sponsored religion in the public schools, but give a resounding yes to voluntary student expression in the public schools, to teach about religion in the appropriate places in the curriculum, to allow student Bible clubs before and after school on the same basis as other clubs are allowed. Anybody in high school have Bible clubs or other kinds? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there are dozens of different ways that religion can and should be included on the public school campus, both in terms of the curriculum, not proselytizing, of course, but teaching about the influence of religion in history, comparative religion courses, the Bible as literature courses, many ways that it can be included, without allowing government to get into the business of trying to promote religion in that inherently coercive context of public schools, where our kids have to go under the compulsory education laws. I mean, we obviously can do parochial education, we can do homeschooling, but in the public schools, the government ought not be involved in promoting religion, but allow religion to flourish on a voluntary basis through student expression. I think I see a hand way in the back, but you're in the dark. I can't see your face.
Sorry, I apologize.
That's all right.
Where do you draw the political line? And I mean, even in matters as simple as like having one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance and things like in God we trust on our currency.
Yeah, a very good question, and that's further evidence that we really don't have a watertight separation of church and state. We really don't have a secular society in the sense of being hostile to religion, because we are a very religious country. And I think we are because of those constitutional provisions that I've been talking about for the past half hour. We are a very religious country, religiously plural and religious. 78% of the American people claim to be Christian. So, in that limited sociological sense, we are a Christian nation, even though we're not legally and constitutionally. But so it should not surprise us in a country as religious as ours that references to God will bubble up in our civic ceremonies, our public rituals, our mottos, our songs, our slogans. It's a part of who we are. And the courts generally, and I think it's a good thing, haven't said we can't do that. It's okay. They call it civil religion. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept. The Supreme Court refers to it as ceremonial deism. But those acknowledgments of our religious heritage are welcomed in our public conversation in a way that probably would not be the case in some of the more secular European democracies, for example, and other places. So, yeah, there's that kind of middle ground in between establishment and free exercise where we say, we're going to allow all of this to kind of bubble up because that's who we are. So, good, very good question. Yes, sir.
This sort of goes off of that a little bit. I'm just curious, where, I knew there has to be some form of separation of church and state, but as a Christian conservative, if I voted for a candidate who said he was a Baptist Christian or whatever, and he said, I would not expect him to sign off on a bill that supported, abortion or something like that. So, while there has to be church and state, wouldn't you agree that there has to be religion has to have some manner of influence?
Absolutely. Yes, yeah. There's no reason why one's political orientation and public philosophy can't be influenced by religious beliefs. I mean, that's who we are. Absolutely. But I think it's wrong to. It's part of the equation, but I think it would be wrong to impose a religious litmus test on candidates. Again, I talked about Article 6 in the Constitution, no religious test for public office. Now, that technically only keeps government from making that requirement. It only restricts what government can or can't do in terms of qualifications for office. But I think the spirit of that principle ought to apply to our behavior as well. So, yeah, religion should be a part of it. It should influence how we see the world and how we do our politics, but it shouldn't be a litmus test that dictates, without regard to anything else, how we vote or how we behave in office when we are elected. But yes, it's a good question. Yeah, the separation of church and state does not divorce religion from politics or strip the public square of talk about religion. So yeah, good. Actually, the talk that I just gave is one that I gave at Stetson University a couple weeks ago, and then two others following on that lecture. One of which, the third one, directly addresses the very good question you just raised. So I would invite you to visit the Baptist Joint Committee website. I think maybe next week. I don't think it's up yet, but you can see that lecture as well at bjconline.org. So yeah, and you ought to spend some good time on that generally too. So and we got a good blog that you'll enjoy reading on a daily basis. Excuse me?
What was your name?
My name? Brent Walker, B-R-E-N-T, Walker. I think we're out of time here, so you tell when we're quitting, and I'd love to resume this at lunchtime, so please come to lunch.